Hello, everybody. This is Bart Sharp, and you are on Becoming Quantum Conscious on United Public Radio Network and UFO Paranormal Radio Network at 107.7 and 103.5, broadcasting out of the beautiful city of New Orleans, Louisiana. And you can catch us on the UPRN website, just uprn.com. Also on Roku, on cable television. Um X, Facebook, YouTube, Spreaker, and other internet platforms out there all around the world. As we got a worldwide community on UPRN, and it makes it so much fun. I never know who's listening, but we are all over the world, and I am still in France, though I live in Austin, Texas, and it's just been a really enjoyable week this week. I got to hear a great talk by one of my former guests, Richard Stanley, who's released a new book this past week. And of course, one of his friends, Hamilton White, was there, who is one of the hosts of Lost Relics of the Templar, who's a constant guest or regular guest, not constant, of Michel de Rocher, The Outer Beyond. So it was nice seeing all of those guys at the famous Rennes-le-Chateau, that great church and village on the hill that everybody writes and talks about, and it it lives up to all of its expectations. A huge power spot in general, and I'd just like to say that there's probably more secrets up there than you can ever imagine. And our guest today is all about uncovering secrets. So I am going to bring her on, and that would be Miss Dani Katz. And we were just talking about you, Dani. Welcome to the show, Dani. This is Dani Katz.
Hi, Bart. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, yes. And I was just talking about Renly Chateau and all the secrets in there. And so much about what you do is uncover secrets about the conscious languaging. Um, and with your book, um, the Language of Betterarchy, and I just love the subtitle of this book, The Language of Betterarchy, a blueprint for uniting against tyranny. How do you think language can be such a powerful force to unite against tyranny? But the way you explain it is really quite eloquent. And we don't have to pick up a gun. We just learn to talk differently. So when you talk about uniting against tyranny, what does that mean to you?
Well, as I was mentioning to you before we started recording, my publisher and I kind of tussled over the subtitle. Because a big part of my work, of my languaging paradigm, is to talk about what we want, to focus on the visions that we are foreseeing for ourselves, and to not position ourselves in an oppositional capacity, as in uniting against. But as my publisher explained, and many marketing experts have explained, marketing language is very different than using language to transform our reality. So I availed myself to my publisher's advice in going with the subtitle, A Blueprint for Uniting Against Tyranny. Basically, the language of betterarchy and the tools that I share in this book are solutions for us. I know so many of us are frustrated with the world situation, can often feel overwhelmed with all of the different systems that are inviting change and transformation. And what I'm offering us is a tool to shift the entire meta construct. Everything in this reality is created with words. I'm not a very religious person. I've never read the Bible, but I know enough to know that in Genesis, God says, or whoever wrote the Bible says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And I've studied that passage very, very deeply. And I feel like there was a clue in that, letting us know that we can create in the same way that God created, using language. The social engineers know very well the power of our words to create and transform reality, which is why they go the distance to keep that information away from us. This book gives us tools to very easily, very gracefully evolve our society for the better.
Yes, and I love what you say. It's like we use words to create a different reality. They're almost like one of the, to me, when you think of the energy of something, that's one vibration that might be a higher vibration, and the word may encapsulate that energy, but it's a little bit rudimentary compared to the energy of, let's say, like being in a high spiritual state or something. However, the word itself can launch somebody in that sequence to get to that higher state of understanding or knowledge or something of that matter. And it just seems like we trip over ourselves or offend people, and we're creating lots of separation between people all the time because we don't have enough understanding of how our language affects people, basically.
100%. And I don't, like, personally, I don't agree with the allegation that we can trigger anyone, right? My triggers are my triggers. You could be speaking neutrally without any intention to trigger me, and one of your words could, of its own accord, trigger something that is already laden in mind that is inviting integration. So a big part of my work is self-responsibility, and turning our attention inwards to notice, where can I take responsibility for my triggers, for the world situation, for the imbalances between the masculine and the feminine, for all the conflict and separation that is pervading the cultural discourse. And this is, again, this is giving us tools to be able to do just that. And like you said, yes, of course, these higher spiritual states transcend language, but there are ways to use language to help move us towards those states, to help shift our internal vibration to those higher frequencies. Again, coming back to that self-responsibility and understanding that we are all reality creators.
Yes, we are at that. And it just, what's so cool about the book is that you begin it by, it's not that the masculine is bad, but and how I see it is, and this is not in, I didn't really read this in your book, but I think we're really parallel with this concept. It's that the masculine is often talking from their woundedness, which would be in their aggression or their fear or their control issues. And so they're using a masculine source instead of their feminine source to express and also act from. And I think it's one of the reasons we have so many problems today is the masculine has to evolve and the feminine needs to have more of a voice today with this.
Agreed. From my perspective, I mean, from science, we live in a realm of equal and opposite forces. So if the masculine is out of balance, then so too is the feminine, right? And so we need to be working together to come into balance. One of the primary precepts of my book is that patriarchy doesn't have anything to do with dudes in charge. And the solutions that we're being invited to activate have nothing to do with putting women in charge. Patriarchy is a lens of perception. And we've all been programmed with a masculine imbalance through generations of indoctrination. And, men in charge is secondary to how we've all been programmed to lean more heavily on those masculine energetics: reason, logic, status, division, conflict, doing versus being. So it doesn't matter if we snapped our fingers and replaced, everyone in government with women. All those women would still be operating with the same imbalanced perspective because we've all been programmed with that same imbalance. And so go ahead, Bart.
I would like to add one more in there: domination versus safety. In other words, we try to dominate with a lot of the masculine force, and people trust that domination because that's how they think. but everybody is thinking from that wounded masculine, from that part. And this is what's so eloquent about your book, is you're just and confrontive about the book. Is it's like you're just saying, this is the truth. These are what's going awry here in our communication modes. But underneath it is the emotional well-being of it all.
Agreed.
And so I want to ask you one more question with this. Maybe this is moving too fast, too quick, but I'll have to ask it anyway. And I just want to say to everybody out there, if you have questions for Dani, and you can also find more about her on her website, danikatz.com. But you can just join in on the chat and question away. She's available for you. So when we kind of distracted myself with that, when we start to use this correct language strategies, it kind of nurtures the feminine, don't you think?
I do. I think it, and I want to, I'm going to be a little more exacting with the language, because the idea of right, wrong, good, bad, better, worse, right? Those are reductive polarities that kind of keep sustaining this outdated hierarchical construct, which I'm inviting us to start questioning and evolving out of in the book, right? So there's nothing wrong with speaking hierarchy or speaking a masculine imbalance. I'm simply talking about ways that are more effective if our aim is to unify, to live in a peaceful realm of abundance, of, harmony, of enough to go around. And I think, for a long time in Los Angeles, after the whole Me Too issue erupted, I saw a lot of women walking around wearing T-shirts that said the future is female. And those didn't sit well with me. No. If we're lobbying for a female dominant future, that goes back to domination, which you just mentioned, Bart, and then the idea of kicking men to the curb, how is that a solution if we need there to be losers for there to be winners? So I think, my aim is for us to get back into balance. It's not alleging any supremacy of feminine over masculine or masculine over feminine. And as well, it's not about confusing feminine and masculine polarities with embodied men and women. I think that's an area where people get really tripped up, that when I'm talking about a masculine imbalance, I'm not talking about men and I'm not denigrating men. I'm talking about the energetics and the lenses of perception through which we're interpreting reality.
Yes, because we have plenty of women out there that wear dresses and they act like men.
Exactly.
And we have plenty of men that are very feminine that wear pants. It's just an odd world we live in. But that's really a lot how it is. And so it's a great journey to be taken into there of going beyond this duality, finding oneness. And you use a great term to explain it, which is kind of your preset before your title, the language of betterarchy, but you're using heterarchy, a term coined by one of my favorite authors, Richard Rudd of the Gene Keys, a great book. And you sound like you're a fan as well of the Gene Keys.
Richard is a dear friend of mine. I've been in the Gene Keys community since 2010, and I interviewed him a number of times to help me with this book. And I'd actually thought initially that it was going to be the language of heterarchy. That was my whole idea for this book. But when I explored heterarchy deeper, I didn't find any instances of large-scale implementation. There were instances of hierarchical departments in larger organizations, but I didn't feel comfortable hanging my hat on heterarchy, given that I hadn't seen any examples of it instituted in a large scale. And then I went on this crazy nerdy exploration. I bought all these vintage Latin dictionaries and prefixes and suffixes, and I was looking for the just right word. Richard Rudd talks about synarchy in the Gene Keys, but synarchy has been weaponized. Adolf Hitler was claiming that the Third Reich was synarchy. So again, I didn't feel comfortable using the word synarchy given how it had been weaponized. And ultimately, I saw myself getting way into the weeds with coming up with the just right words. So I was like, all right, it's betterarchy because it's better, and we'll figure out what it actually is as we start implementing these tools and the new version of society starts to present itself to us.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's more expansive than heterarchy because that was a concept that Rudd explained in one chapter of his book, uh, as he does so brilliantly.
Yeah.
But can you kind of explain to everybody what heterarchy is?
Absolutely. So let me start with hierarchy. So hierarchy is defined as a system of organization that is defined by privilege and status, right? Under hierarchy, there's always going to be a top dog and, you know, someone on welfare living in a ghetto. And hierarchy is really dependent on this sort of inequity. Heterarchy is a system of organization that privileges no one over one another. So it's more equal. And there are a lot of, you know, I interviewed a lot of people on heterarchy to really hone in on it. And it is a much more feminine, idealistic, kind of circular means of organization. But as I said, as I'm proposing that we reorganize our entire global society into what I'm calling betterarchy, I just wasn't sure how we were going to be able to pull off heterarchy with my limited understanding of it.
Yeah, I like the way you explain it. It's just like it's kind of a reality that everybody has something to contribute. That you know there is not a better or less in a society, and we start recognizing that as a reality that we all contribute in some way to a greater whole.
Exactly. And one thing that I like about heterarchy that I just want to mention here is that in a heterarchical structure similar to a betterarchical structure, everyone serves different roles. And some people are going to achieve in certain roles and some people won't, but we're not placing a different value judgment. We're not saying that the brain surgeon is a more valuable human than the janitor who works in the hospital. Everyone has their own roles to play, but they're not ranked. We're honoring the equal value of everyone's humanity, regardless of how that expresses.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and I think it's also when people start thinking of that concept, they think of it in monetary terms. And it doesn't mean that everybody has the same amount of money. It means that everybody has a value that in some way is undefinably equal from that.
100%.
Yeah.
And what I point to, and forgive me if I'm taking us into a realm where you're not wanting to go, but it just occurred to me when you said that is a lot of the inequities baked into our culture. Sure, we have systemic issues with redlining, when we had the crime bill and all of those things, but inequality is baked into our language. And what I'm pointing out in my book, The Language of Betterarchy, is when we are speaking status and not even realizing that we're putting other people down or raising ourselves up, and how common that is in our everyday language, that we're privileging and unprivileging without even realizing that we're doing it.
Exactly. It is so systemic.
Yes.
And every time we do it, we're basically judging, which whenever we judge, it kind of begins to narrow our viewpoint even more. It creates density in our body. In a way, we're less wise. Our emotional intelligence doesn't grow in that type of state of being. So that's why I think this book is so valuable. It's like, let's unravel this stuff.
I appreciate that. And there's a whole section in the book on judgment, and judgment implies that whoever's judging has some sort of superior knowingness or authority to judge, right? So let's say you were wearing a red shirt and I said that shirt is ugly, right? that would be alleging that I have some sort of almighty objective judging status or authority versus saying it's not my preference, right? And that's something that I see happening all the time, is people smearing their own personal opinions onto reality as though it's objective fact. And when we do that, it causes other people to contract and armor up and defend, because people don't like being on the receiving end of other people's judgments, of other people claiming to have a higher authority to judge. Now, all of this is happening on a subconscious level, but it's happening, and these are, tiny bits and pieces that contribute to lackluster communication, to conflict, to feelings of ill will in conversations where these feelings of ill will don't have to be there. If we were just a little bit more mindful and conscientious about the coding in our language, we would be resourced to use our language in such a way that honors everyone we're speaking to, instead of subtly playing this hierarchy game where we're putting people down and we're not even realizing that we're doing it.
Exactly. And we're expected to do it. It's almost like people are matching up their own judgments with your judgments if you're starting to play that game. And I love the way, maybe this is this is one of my favorite quotes in the book, when you talk about the matrix. Mm-hmm. As it says, and I'm just going to just read this out straight. As such, the matrix is propped up by a steady stream of programming intending to keep the populace skizzed out on fear, crisis, and conflict, while manipulating us into believing that we are small and limited and separate, and thus need its systems and safety nets to protect us. And to me, the whole bottom line underneath that are judgments and definitions, and all of that leads to criticizing, control, and just judging things into a rigid definition, creating the matrix.
Yes. So, part of my work, I started off as a journalist, and I'm pretty much driven by root causes and solutions. So I'm always looking at okay, well, what's the truth behind the truth? And then what's the origin point behind that? And just going as far back as possible, which is what took me to hierarchy and examining, as a journalist, I write a lot about propaganda. I have a book on propaganda and a course on propaganda, and realizing that people aren't going to understand how propaganda operates until they understand this control matrix that's been overlaid on top of society, and how that control matrix needs us to hate ourselves. It needs us feeling less than or too much. It needs us to be in a constant state of problem so that we can always be reaching outside of ourselves for its various dangling carrots. That's how the whole matrix construct works. There's an illustration in the book of someone on a habit trail chasing a carrot. Right? So if we knew ourselves as whole, as lovable, as perfect as we are, this whole matrix construct would fall apart, because we wouldn't be chasing all of their dangling carrots. And so when I look to, well, what is the root cause of this whole situation? It's the weaponization of the word authority, and how when we go to the etymology of authority, it comes from the Latin word auctor, which means builder, founder, one who causes to grow. That is very different than where we've come today, with authority being, someone outside of us who gives us permission to do something or not do something. So I think the conflation of authority as being something that is outside of us, instead of our own internal God-given right to write our stories however we choose, I think that's one of the fundamental issues that keeps this control matrix running, because everyone is reaching outside of themselves for validation, acknowledgement, permission, dopamine, instead of self-sourcing, knowing ourselves whole and filling ourselves up with our own godliness.
Indeed. I love that. And just to add a little bit, how many times have you heard somebody talking in their own frustrations, and they'll say, well, they're doing this to us. And you ask them, well, who's they? And they can't really tell you, well, it's the system, it's the matrix, or, they almost want to personalize it to an unknown enemy where it's really you connecting to that, as you say in the book, morphogenetic field, and believing that that has power over it instead of just what you said, connecting with your own inner God source and learning how to do that.
Exactly. And this is the paradigm shift that I'm calling for, because for those of us with eyes to see, the last 4 years, the last 10 years, the last, since 9/11 have been very, very frustrating. And I know a lot of people can feel powerless against, these unnamed invisible boogeymen. And what I continue to share and to get us to grok is that we have the power. It's we can say no, we can remove our consent, we can remove our attention, we can remain empowered while choosing to comply or not comply. It's a matter of how we're going to frame ourselves in relation to what's happening in the world. And when we say, they're doing this to me, when I say that, I have just used my words to connect myself with the frequency bands of victimhood in the morphogenetic field. And therefore, the universe is going to give me more circumstances wherein I can see myself as a powerless victim. So what I want us to understand is how much power we have in this situation and how much power we have to switch the game. Take the very simple phrase, the powers that be. Every time I hear, a brilliant truth teller reference the powers that be, I'm yelling at my computer and saying the powers that were. Stop validating their false power. Let's remove our consent and call it what it is, the powers that were, because we have the power to make a different choice in every now moment.
Exactly. And that's really what the time requires right now, is voices like that. And so we're kind of at the half point of this show. And I just want to switch directions and tell everybody that you are listening to Dani Katz, author of The Language of Betterarchy. And you can check out her website at danikatz.com. That's DANIKATZ. And she's from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I am Bart Sharp, and you're listening to Becoming Quantum Conscious on United Public Radio and UFO Paranormal Radio on 107.7 and 105.3 out of New Orleans, Louisiana. Also seen on Roku television or cable television, Roku, Facebook, YouTube, UPRN website, and other internet platforms out there. So we're kind of let's shift. I mean, we've really talked a lot about what's up and how this masculine world has kind of gone astray, and they're kind of working through their own, or working out of, because they're not a lot of times not working through it, but they're working out of their traumas, out of their unresolved emotions, out of the feminine issues they've not resolved, and they perpetuated this for hundreds of years, who knows how long. And you're offering something that gives tools to people how to do it differently. And so what if we just start talking about some of those things in your book that can help people have better languaging?
Absolutely. So the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section is called The Myth of Patriarchy, where we dispel our confusion about patriarchy, and we dispel any fictions that matriarchy is going to be the solution. Because what I'm proposing is that if we're operating in a system that needs there to be losers for there to be winners, it's a stupid system that it's time for us to evolve out of. The second part of the book is how language creates reality and really breaking it down so that we can take that from some woo-woo nonsense into some grounded, pragmatic, applicable understanding of how our every word functions as reality programming technology. And then the third part of the book features the 10 different precepts of hierarchical languaging, to help us recognize when we are speaking hierarchy. Because when I am speaking hierarchy, then I am sustaining and empowering that outdated system. When I switch up my languaging patterns such that I'm speaking betterarchy, I'm withdrawing my consent from hierarchy, thus pulling the wind out of its sails and helping it kind of just fall away of its own accord, while I'm creating more energy, and I'm casting my vote for a betterarchical reality that is marked by abundance, harmony, peace, and all those wonderful things. So, we start off with separation because a lot of the languaging precepts that I talk about in this book all come under the umbrella of separation. Looking at identity constructs, people who are identifying, I am a Republican, I am a Democrat, thereby conflating voting preferences with their existential beingness, right? So when I say I am a Republican, when I go into the voting booth, it's going to be a lot harder for me to vote for a libertarian policy or a green candidate when I'm conflating my actual personhood with a political preference, right? But when I shift that from I historically have voted Republican, I tend to align with Republican ideals, right? And these are all examples. I don't really play the political game. But when I unidentify and I talk about behaviors and predilections as behaviors and predilections, it's easier for me to make different choices because I'm not putting myself in the position of needing an entire existential overhaul, because I've mistaken a voting inclination with who I actually am. We can see another instance of this with anti, which crosses over again into identity, but as well as conflict. So think of people who identify as anti-sexist. If I'm claiming to be anti-sexist, I need to find instances of sexism to validate my mission, to have a reason for being. From that perspective, I'm going to take every single neutral occurrence that happens and I'm going to run it through my sexism lens of perception to see if I can find a match so that I can have a reason to be on mission, to be on purpose, right?
It almost sounds like you create a hypersensitivity to that particular issue and that doing so.
Absolutely. It creates a hypersensitivity and it creates what we call a quantum entanglement, where I need instances of sexism to have a purpose, right? So now I kind of am reliant on sexism to continue to exist for me to have a mission because I've positioned myself in this oppositional capacity. For anyone who's read Dr. David Hawkins' Power versus Force, and for anyone who hasn't, I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's one of my favorite books. But he'll talk about... Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Bart.
No, it's one of my favorite books, too. We'll like Richard Rudd and David Hawkins.
Yeah. And so we know that force always creates counterforce. So with that understanding, I'm never going to position myself as anti-anything, because when we do that, all it does is empower whatever the anti is modifying. So if I claim to be an anti-sexist, just by articulating the word sexist through my vehicle and putting that programming into the morphogenetic field, I've just cast my vote for more sexism in our shared reality construct. It's much smarter to simply go to, well, what is the solution? Gender equality, right? So if this were a movement that I wanted to take on, and personally I'm not a fan of movements, then it would be much smarter and more effective to say I stand for gender equality. Now I'm standing for the vision that I'm holding of that solution. I'm connecting with the energetic frequency of that solution, thereby radiating that frequency into the world. We have seen so much, like such a giant uptick in racism since Black Lives Matter hit the scene under President Obama, right? So first of all, we're supposed to buy that like race relations had devolved to such dismal point under the first Black president that we needed this Black Lives Matter. But because of the coding in that languaging that was consistently programming our reality with separation, with an attunement to an age-old, outdated racial inequality, we have seeded our reality with more of that than I've ever seen in my lifetime. I have not seen more racism in my lifetime than since post Black Lives Matter. And I can see a very direct correlation in that languaging and how that's programmed our reality construct.
It's all about the polarity, isn't it? When a topic is brought up like that, and it's brought up in a polarized way, almost like most people fall on one side of the fence or the other side, thinking that that's the way they should think, as opposed to what you're sharing as neutrality.
100%.
Like, I wonder what this has to do with me. Wonder what it feels like to be in this role as an anti-Black Lives Matters. What does that feel like in my body to be on that side? Or what does it feel like to be pro-Black Lives Matters and those principles and just feel them, kind of, you know?
Polarities are another section in the book. And it really doesn't matter the issue. If we're a pro or an anti, we're fueling the entire reductive, toxic construct. I've been on a number of shows talking about the misuse of the term anti-Semitism in terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I've had a number of hosts completely flip out on me. Oh, so you're pro this, so you're anti this. And every time I'm like, no, because I'm not part of that construct. Like I will not engage in any sort of pro-anti construct because it doesn't matter which side you pick. It's all a trap. And so
what would you say to a person like that?
I just say it's not my paradigm. I don't take sides. I saw this during the FOVID op, and I saw so many people claiming to be anti-vax. And I was like, ooh, like when we claim to be anti-vax, we're normalizing vaccines as that's the baseline. And I'm not going to lend any credence to that ridiculous fiction. Also, I'm not going to align myself in an oppositional capacity because I don't like to fight. Like, I'm a lover, not a fighter.
Yeah, I would just say to people, well, it's a hard decision and everybody has to come to that terms due to the times. And I support everybody. And that's kind of how I've dealt with it with people. And then I go, oh, well, how's your sex life? Or how's the weather? Something like that.
I love that you did that, Bart, because this is a strategy that I give to a lot of my coaching clients and consulting clients, is when we're in a conversation that could get contentious, to remove ourselves from the construct that is causing contention and then immediately change the subject.
Yeah. And something I'm always asking people, because I do shamanic work and I'm always perceiving people's bodies, but I'm always asking that question when people are in that trauma about something, and they can be talking about politics or, all of these different issues, but when they kind of get blown up into it, I just ask that question to myself, not to them. They really get mad at me if I did. I just say, I wonder what pain they're in. And I feel that pain in their body, and I just pay attention to it. And I listen to them, and I try to say less as possible, and they kind of deflate out of it sometimes, or wisdom shows up, and I'm able to say something that actually makes sense, it's really how I deal with it.
That's beautiful. I mean, I think that speaks to your excellence as a healer, right? Where you're not getting caught up in the back and forth. You're pulling back to consider the actual human being and what might be informing their perspectives and their rhetoric. And that's beautiful. And thank you for doing that on behalf of humanity.
Yeah, that's why I like your book, because you're going along some of the same lines.
Thank you.
And that's well needed for people to hear how the conflict started, but also, some of the strategies, because it does take practice to understand, well, what are the right things to say.
Yeah, it does. And again, I no means mean any disrespect to you, Bart, is there's never any right or wrong thing to say. It's just what's going to be more effective if our intentions are peace, or if our intentions are harmony. There are more effective ways. But I think, a lot of that right, wrong, better, worse
Yep.
is sustaining the issues that we're having,
Yes.
and sustaining a lot of the conflict that we don't need to have. Like, I have observed so many arguments because I'm always wondering, like, where's that one moment where it goes from conversation to argument? Like, what flips the switch? And it's separation. It's as soon as someone alleges separation, and us, them, something like that, then the other person who's on the receiving end of that, the armor goes up, the defenses come up, and now we're in an argument. So how can we share different ideas, different perspectives, while maintaining our shared humanity within the conversation?
Amen. It's so spot on. And so I think that happens all the time. Our defenses come up, and all of a sudden the walls are there, and the language starts to shift because people do not feel secure with a person because they feel separate from them. And what do you do when that happens?
When the argument escalates into conflict.
Yeah, or it's going in that direction. The separation is there, and you sense it. What can you do?
I think the key is to find the unifying factor and to lean into that. To find what is the Venn diagram of our shared humanity, of our crossover, and how can I speak to that? So if we're going off the rails on an issue, right? That issue is an abstraction out here. So then it's coming back to, like, Bart, I know that you want what's best for your family. Right? I know that it's like whatever that I can see that you're prioritizing, that it's important to you, and validating that and leaning into that and bringing it back to, I see you as a person. I recognize you. I recognize what is important to you. I'm not trying to discount that at all. And then finding a way to weave what I'm talking about into your priorities, your values, your desires, right? Bring it back to that shared humanity, which is such a grounding factor in our engaging.
Oh wow, that's so well said. It's it's a very tricky one, but it's very simple. It's like, can you let go of your own walls and bridges to try to find that path of connection? And as soon as and maybe part of it is like, knowing that you're already in that separation. If you have that awareness, you're probably a step ahead of the other person who's not aware that they have the separation yet. Do I follow you right? Okay.
You do. And I also want to speak to, like, and I'll just speak for myself, because I'm still a work in process. I write my books because these are the tools that are helping me evolve and master myself. So a lot of times in conversations, I'm pretty passionate. I can get triggered and I can go into separation. And then I will examine, like, where am I not feeling seen? What is feeling threatened in me? And how can I soothe that for the other person? So even though I don't know that the other person is having that issue, but if I'm in a conversation where I'm not feeling seen, I know my smartest strategy is to go the distance to see and validate the other person. And that just, because it just brings the whole conversation into a more grounded human place.
Indeed. And one thing you're doing when you're doing that is you're asking questions to yourself, which opens up awareness.
All the time. And that's the key with every trigger is what unhealed part of me is trying to get my attention. Not this person did something wrong. This person said this. This person did this to me. It's what is going on with me and what steps do I need to integrate this piece of myself back into peace so that I can be more regulated.
Indeed. It's always a constant reflection inside of yourself. And to me, when you start to open that up, you're really opening up your sincerity and your heart. You're staying less in your head. And a different perspective is starting to show up because you're really starting to recognize your masculine defensive systems in those situations.
Exactly.
Yeah. And separation is so big. I know that's a big part of these, but you also have 9 categories. Did I remember that correctly?
Yeah, it's 10, but I have lack and limitation sharing their own chapter because so many of the remedies are similar. So yes, there's separation, there's identity, there's conflict, there's fear, there's status, there's wrong use of will, lack and limitation. There's what I call fixity. And fixity is a fun one. I think it might be the most abstract, but it's
Oh my God. I'm just thinking of somebody in my own personal life that's always trying to fix my stuff.
Well, the fixity that I reference in the book is referring to any languaging patterns that make us that imply permanence, that because something was a certain way that it always has to continue on in that way. And that's one of the tricks of the control matrix, is to make us think that we cannot change. And so one of the things that I play with the book is nouns as traps, and realizing how noun heavy the English language is, and how nouns are really cages. And the more that we can move nouns into verbs or even adjectives and put things in motion and take that solidity away, the more freedom we have to change our reality.
Now, that's a very abstract concept. Can
Very
you
abstract.
just throw out a couple examples of that?
Yes. So the way it came up in the book was around emotions and some more negative emotions, right? So instead of saying, I'm feeling a lot of rage, raging is moving through me. Angering is happening, right? It's taking the solidity away. I had a client who had a really tough time in a meeting with a lawyer, and she kept saying, well, I'm an empath and I'm an empath. And I'm like, okay, but in this instance, that story, that identity construct is actually working against you. So how about if we turn empath into empathing, and you can choose when empathing is going to serve you, but in instances when empathing is not your best bet, you can leave it aside and pick up a different energetic to walk in where it's like, oh, I'm adulting, or I'm looking out for myself. I'm looking out for my family. It's even
so the noun is really like, when you get out of the noun mentality, you're really stepping out of the judgment that you have put on yourself or another person.
Exactly. Or even on, pathologies just pop to mind. So, a lot of times the Western medical paradigm will pathologize temporary systems or symptoms, thus making them seem more fixed. So instead of I have a headache, It's I'm noticing some sensations moving through my head. I'm in the process of clearing some pressure in my head, right? I've taken something static, a headache, and I've put it in motion. There are sensations that are moving through me, thus directing my subconscious mind. We don't need to hang out here too long. We don't need to hold on to these sensations. We can send them on their way.
And this is kind of like a quantum, this is what you mean by quantum languaging,
Yes.
that actually you're identifying what's happening in a language, but you're dealing with this on almost like an energetic basis when you put it into a verb. You're asking your body to feel the sensation of what it's like to be empathing or headaching or stressing, etc. So it allows you to interact with it and thus detach from it. Whereas when you judge it and create it as a noun, you're locked into it. You get all of those past perceptions all meshed together at the same time.
100%. And on top of those past perceptions, then we have the probabilities attached to the diagnosis or the pathologies or the stories or the negative associations. Like all of those get lumped into those nouns. As I understand it, the Mayan culture did not have nouns. Everything was a verb.
Wow.
Life is chairing right now. If I'm sitting on a chair, it would be like I'm sitting on chairing. This is a temporary configuration in this infinite realm of possibility. And I feel like, the density of this realm is a direct result of this noun heavy language. And I really believe that were we to shift a lot of our nouns into verbs, it would lift the density and we would have a lot more say, a lot more, clear impact on shifting our reality, which would shift much more easily. I don't believe this density is a function of its own accord. I don't think it has to be that way. I think we've languaged ourselves into the illusion of fixity.
That's brilliant. And so all of these chapters instruct you how to, as you read them, you will get an idea of how you fit into these schemes of things, but also being able to learn how to be more in the action of it as opposed to the solidity of it, which you go into more of a quantum perspective with that. We're coming down to the last couple of minutes of the show. So, Dani, if you'll be thinking about it like a 1-minute message you'd like to give to everybody, and I'm going to give the call letters. We are talking with Dani Katz, author of The Language of Betterarchy, and you can check her out at danikatz.com. Check out the book on various bookstores. It's out there all over the place. And you are on Becoming Quantum Conscious. I am Bart Sharp, and this is United Public Radio and UFO Paranormal Radio at 107.7 and 103.5 out of New Orleans. Also on cable television, Roku, Facebook, Twitter, X. I always say Twitter. I haven't let it go. I need an action with that. And YouTube. So, Dani, oh yes, and next week we're bringing back Jeff Cataria, and he will be discussing a book on trans-dimensional being. And I'm reading this book, and it's wild. It even stretches my imagination, and I love those type of topics. So it's going to be really flying high on that show. Just as this show has been great and a wonderful gift that you've given us with Betterarchy. This is something that can create a lot of change in the world. So I recommend everybody check it out. And Dani, what would you like to leave with parting words?
Bart, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And I would just like people to know and recognize how much power we have. Every single one of us is a reality creator. Every single one of us has the opportunity to make a massive impact on our world. And we don't need a podcast to do it. We don't need a television show. We don't need a stage and a big following. We can effect enormous change in our local communities with our every single conversation once we learn how to use our language to unify, uplift, inspire, empower. And I encourage all of us to claim this power that we have and to really start to learn to use our every word for the good, because together we can move the needle and we absolutely can course correct our world for the better.
Those are great words to end the show. Thank you so much, Dani Katz at danikatz.com for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Bart. Much appreciated.
Let's build a better world, and we'll see y'all all next week.